Minimaps are the bane of my existence. Okay, it's not that deep, but more often than not, they do hinder my enjoyment of a game. The vast majority of them contain so much useful information, ranging from the locations and positionings of enemies, to points of interest worth exploring, to the best path to take in order to reach any given destination. It's such a valuable tool that it becomes hard to not overly rely on it. Almost everything the player needs to know is contained within it, and personally, when playing a game that has one, I constantly catch myself staring at the corner of the screen while traveling from one place to the next, focused on following a line instead of meaningfully engaging with the world I'm playing in. I try my best to only look at it when I need to, but I struggle to stick to that. The sheer amount of intel it contains is too tempting to ignore, and in a similar way as to how I check my phone far too often to be sure I haven't missed a text or an email or a funny post on Twitter, I can't help but glance over at the minimap to see if I'm on the right track. They synthesize loads of information into an easy-to-digest circle or square that is designed to support players as much as possible, so they don't become frustrated by getting lost or missing something important or being spotted by an enemy they didn't even realize could see them. Minimaps make things more convenient, and whether or not this is a good or bad thing really depends on the goals of the games they're in. Like, take RTSs and MOBAs. The minimaps in most of these types of titles show the movements of the player's units and allies, as well as the movements of the enemies when they're close by. As action can be happening all over the map, the minimap allows players to quickly gauge what is going on in order to decide how or if they should intervene. Also, when they need a closer look at what's happening, the minimap makes it easy to click over to different spots instead of having to manually scroll to them. In order to be effective, players need to use them, but focusing on the minimap too much will put them at a disadvantage, as it will distract from their other responsibilities, like building out their base, upgrading units, and of course, attacking the enemy. Due to the competitive nature of these types of games, efficient usage of the minimap can be the difference between winning and losing. It is a vital mechanic that helps players engage more with the core gameplay loop. When it comes to most other games that have minimaps though, the need for efficiency is not all that important. The quality of an open world title isn't determined by how quickly a player can get through it. In fact, most would say that a good open world game is one they can get lost in, where the player goes off to do something that catches their interest and then realize that hours have passed without them noticing. And sure, I do understand why games, especially rather big ones, give players as many tools as possible so they don't get confused in one way or another, but this can take away from the player's ability to figure things out themselves. When exploration is just following a series of lines from one place to the next, it doesn't feel like exploring. The majority of minimaps are almost too helpful for their own good, as they trivialize navigation and exploration by providing information that is more detailed and reliable than what the player could ascertain from just looking around in the game itself. Really, it disincentivizes organic discovery. Instead of assisting players in engaging with the core gameplay loop, it essentially does the work for them. To be fair, this is appealing to a lot of people. Some folks just want to be in the action and not spend much time finding it. Navigation is not a game mechanic everyone is interested in. Also, there are many people who struggle with making their way through digital spaces, so having a strong guide makes it possible for them to play titles that they wouldn't be up for otherwise. It broadens the potential audience, which is a good thing. However, it does come at the cost of undermining exploration a bit. Now, the counter some of you may have to everything I've said so far is, if you hate minimaps so much, why don't you just turn them off, as that's an option in most titles. And the problem with that, of course, is most games aren't designed in a way where it's viable to do so. The information on them is not just there to assist the player with where to go, it's also there because it's a simple way for developers to communicate where they want players to go. It's a design choice that offers a simple solution to a complicated problem. Getting directions from an NPC that's based around notable landmarks or names of towns and streets is incredibly cool, but it is also a lot of work to implement. Take The Witcher 3. There are hundreds of quests in the game, most of which have multiple locations players must go to. Having an NPC give detailed instructions of how to get to the next quest marker for every single one would have taken a tremendous amount of effort. When considering everything that goes into developing a game, the idea of CD Projekt Red creating unique directions to each waypoint feels wildly unrealistic, as there not only are a ton of them, but also not every marker is by something notable, making it near impossible to write anything of substance. There are also quests that have players traveling across large chunks of the map, which would call for long and complicated instructions that most likely would be hard to follow. So instead, the minimap fills all that information in. In fairness to The Witcher 3, there are a handful of quests where players are given a landmark-based route to follow, but they're few and far between. The more common approach is just giving a single cardinal direction, like something being being to the west. The problem is, without the minimap, it is often very difficult to know which way west even is. And while there are some customization options, there's no way to just have a simple compass on screen. So without a good way to know which way is which, these instructions aren't all that useful. Frankly though, getting from place to place isn't even the biggest way the devs use the minimap to convey important information to the player. It is far more impactful in the ways it affects smaller scale stuff. There are many quests in The Witcher 3 where Geralt has to do something at a very specific spot, and while some of these can be discovered with the Witcher sense or just noticing details in the environment, many of them require going to a location that can really only be found using the map. For instance, the Witcher contract Mysterious Tracks takes players to a cave on a hill where Geralt deduces that the monster he is looking for is a chort, and in order to kill it, he needs to lure it back to the cave. Players are then given the instruction to pour bait around the hill. For it to work though, it can't just be placed anywhere. There are 4 specific and relatively small spots it needs to go, and there is no way to know where those are by just looking around. So for players not using the minimap, they need to refer to the main one. And while I'm sure someone with a better memory and sense of space would only need to open it once to memorize all the points they need to go, I found myself checking it multiple times for each location, as finding the exact spot proved difficult. Playing without the minimap is not the intended experience, and it leads to a handful of consequences, the most notable of which is how it forces players to rely way more on the primary map. This is obviously to be expected to a degree, as players have to figure out where places are somehow, and combing every inch of the world in order to find what they're looking for would be tedious and terrible. But the amount of times in The Witcher 3 that most players will need to check their map is a bit ridiculous. They'll pretty much have to do it whenever they get a new objective for a quest, or are closing in on a destination, or have to interact with something in the environment in a particular way, or are looking for a merchant, as despite there being many people with the name merchant, only a few of them are actually able to be traded with, and there is no way to tell one from the other aside from running up to them and mashing the talk button. When playing a game where I've turned off the minimap, I'm fine with having to check the main map more frequently, but there is a point where it becomes a nuisance, and for me at least, The Witcher 3 definitely crosses that line. One of the reasons I like to turn off the minimap in games is so I can feel more immersed in the world around me, but having to constantly interrupt gameplay detracts from that sense of immersion. Pulling up the map halts all the momentum, and even though it just takes a second or so to load, that time eventually adds up. With The Witcher 3, all of these issues are compounded by the layout of the world itself, namely that pretty much everywhere looks about the same. And although there are notable structures that can help players orient themselves, due to its vastness, it's easy to get off track. To give a sense of scale, the region that contains Novigrad and Velen is roughly the same size as the entirety of Breath of the Wild, and where Breath of the Wild has a lot of varied environments throughout its map, the majority of Velen is swampy woods and farms. The sameness of the environment makes it hard to actually become familiar with anywhere in it. Skellige is a bit better with this, as players will typically be by a coast, which can act as a sort of guide, but it still runs into the same issue of most places looking similar. To be clear, that's not to say that there aren't incredible locations spread across the world of The Witcher 3. There are many, but much of the stuff between them all blends together. On top of that, as signposts are just a way to contextualize fast travel and not there to point players in the right direction, without using the map, it is almost impossible to know where any path will lead. It doesn't matter how many times I ride from Crow's Perch to Crookback Bog, I will always make at least 3 wrong turns. With that said, more often than not, it is possible to point Geralt in the direction of a waypoint and ride in a straight line to it, regardless of whether or not there is a path. But this doesn't help players learn how to navigate the world. It just allows them to cut through it. While it is possible to play The Witcher 3 without the minimap, doing so can be pretty frustrating unless you're using mods that help with certain aspects of navigation. It just isn't designed to be played that way. Its general structure creates many gaps that make it a difficult world to navigate, and the minimap is a way to fill most of those gaps in. Using minimaps partially as a way to cover these sorts of holes in design is common throughout the industry, because frankly, adding some sort of navigational UI is a much easier solution than including the elements that would make it possible to play without one, like detailed directions to each objective, clear signposting on every path, even more notable landmarks around the world, and tighter quest design. And when considering that the vast majority of folks out there have grown so accustomed to using minimaps that it is unlikely they'll turn them off, including those aspects is not a high priority to most developers, as it would add a considerable amount of work to accommodate a small portion of players. Of course, it is possible to structure a game with a massive scope in a way that doesn't create the kinds of gaps that get in the way of navigation, the most notable recent examples being Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring. Both titles offer some form of a navigational tool, but neither are needed in order to effectively traverse their respective worlds, and this is achieved through how their worlds and gameplay loops are structured. Like, both maps revolve around a central landmark. In Elden Ring, it's the Erd Tree, and in Breath of the Wild, it's Hyrule Castle. The two are visible from great distances, and especially early on, they're one of the best ways for the player to orient themselves. They're markers that can be quickly referred back to, so even if the player feels lost, they at least can figure out where they are in relation to the respective landmarks. The Erd Tree can be seen from most places in the world, but Hyrule Castle is far smaller, and therefore less ever-present, so as players venture further out, they eventually will lose sight of it. However, Breath of the Wild gets around this through the use of the Divine Beasts. Not only can they be seen from a distance as well, but also after each is freed, they climb to a high vantage point and shoot a beam of light towards Hyrule Castle, extending the range of how far the player can be from the castle while still being able to see where it is. Along with that, both games have tons of distinct regions with notable landmarks of their own that players can use to center themselves on a smaller scale. In fact, a lot of the time, the landmarks in these areas are where the player needs to go in order to advance the main quest, so as they will most likely be drawn to explore and examine those spots, they'll naturally progress without even really thinking about it. Additionally, by giving the regions such varied looks, it allows for each chunk of the map to stand out more, making it easy for players to tell where they are and travel from one area to the next. It also helps keep things fresh, and in some ways make the worlds feel bigger than they are, as players are more likely to remember the amount of areas a game has rather than the specific size of any one location. Furthermore, the primary things players can interact with are obvious. Shrines and Sheikah Towers shine bright orange and are made of a material that feels alien compared to the lush plains and forests of Hyrule, and the various caves, tunnels, and catacombs of Elden Ring all use some sort of a light source to stand out against whatever rock face they are part of. On the gameplay side of things, both titles prioritize discovery above all else, whether it be coming across shrines, Koroks and dragons, or caverns, churches, and also dragons. The two center their gameplay loops around uncovering new places in order to get more powerful. Exploring is at the heart of each game, and they'd be extremely difficult to beat without doing a fair bit of it. Stumbling across interesting things is what players will do the most of, which is different from how many open world games work. Looking back at The Witcher 3, even though there are many little secrets to discover across the map, the thing players will do more than anything else is complete quests, all of which ask Geralt to go to some fixed spot. When players are in the middle of a quest, getting lost on their way is annoying, as they just want to get to their destination. However, in Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild, wandering aimlessly is sort of the point. It is hard to feel lost when you aren't heading towards anything specific. Whatever the player discovers, as long as it benefits them in some way, turns into what they were searching for. While both games have quests, very few present any sort of urgency, and they typically follow the design philosophy of the rest of their respective games, with quest givers telling players things to look out for instead of giving them a waypoint. Where The Witcher 3 is about going to places, Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring are about finding places. Players don't need to be on the right path, because at least from a moment-to-moment perspective, there is rarely a right path to be on. With that said, there are destinations players are guided to through map markers and waypoints, but they aren't used to the same extent as they are in other open world titles. They signify starting points, and where to go from there is almost always on the player. The design of their main quests also differ from their contemporaries, as they don't have players jumping back and forth across the world. In fact, there is a pretty natural exploration progression for each game. In Breath of the Wild, players will first be led to Kakariko Village, and then eventually move around the map from Zora's Domain to Death Mountain to Rito Village, and then to the Gerudo Desert. And in Elden Ring, most will go from Stormvale to Raya Lucaria to Leyendell, and then to the mountaintops of giants. Most players probably will jump around the map at one point or another in order to explore new places, but the main path of progression is easy to follow, and it doesn't force players to go out of their way to advance. This lets them work through each area naturally, discovering things in the region they're in without having to regularly go halfway across the map to talk to someone who will tell them that they need to go back to the other side of the map in order to finish the quest. All of these things combined help players navigate the worlds of each game without the need of a minimap or compass. And while they almost certainly will still have to check the main map every so often for a bit of direction, it won't be all that common of an occurrence, as both the structure of the world and gameplay loops are designed in a way where direction isn't all that necessary. Now, not every title can, should, or will be designed like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring. Developers all have their own vision for what kind of game they want to make, and the approach these two titles take don't work well for certain ideas, primarily ones that center around in-depth quests and and stories. So for games that won't take structural cues from the likes of Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, and also won't add detailed navigational elements like directions and signposting, what can be done to make not playing with a minimap a less tedious experience for those who choose to do so? The easiest and most obvious answer is to give a toggle option that lets players turn it on and off at will without having to go into the menus, like with Red Dead Redemption 2. While it does a better job than The Witcher 3 of providing in-game direction to players primarily through the use of signposts, it still suffers from a handful of the same issues. Players frequently have to travel between far-off mission markers without having a reliable way to find them unless they check the map often. There are many missions that require engaging with a specific spot that isn't made obvious, and there are so many paths around the world that can be taken that it is easy to get lost by going down the wrong one. However, when playing RDR2 without the minimap, I found myself far less annoyed than I did when playing The Witcher 3, because instead of it being something that had to either be on or off, it allowed me to switch it at will. Once it's turned off, hitting down on the D-pad will bring the minimap back up for a bit, so players can quickly orient themselves before it goes away again. Despite being a somewhat small and simple feature, it saved me a ton of time and frustration, as whenever I felt unsure about if I was on the right track or not, I didn't have to interrupt what I was doing to figure it out. This solution isn't perfect, but it is a decent middle ground that allows players who don't want to feel tethered to a minimap to have it off for most of the game without wasting a stupid amount of time. I don't want to assume that this would be an easy feature to add to most games, as I've never programmed one, but it feels like it would be, and I think every title with some form of navigational UI would benefit greatly from implementing something like it. A more complicated but also more interesting approach is to make all navigational tools diegetic. Consider Firewatch and Metro Exodus. In both games, the map is a physical thing the player character pulls out, making it feel like a part of the gameplay instead of just a menu that's disconnected from the action. The player can still walk and look around while having it out, so it doesn't seem like as big of an interruption. It also makes it easier to get pointed in the right direction, as the feedback is immediate. Even though players are still pressing a button to pull up a map, implementing it in this way keeps them in the moment, and instead of shattering the player's sense of immersion, it adds to it. Another example of diegetic navigation can be seen with the guiding wind in Ghost of Tsushima. As the player sets a destination, the wind will blow in the direction they need to go, leading them without being distracting. They also can activate the wind whenever they want by swiping the touchpad, putting the power in their hands to help themselves when they feel lost. It accomplishes everything a destination marker does on a minimap without taking up screen space that gets in the way of the gorgeous environments in the game. Lastly, Elden Ring has its own take on diegetic navigation in the form of placing beacons on the map that then appear as pillars of light in-game. It becomes a physical thing that can be seen from great distances, so when players get off track, all they need to do is look up at the sky and head towards it. Adding in these kinds of features is more involved than including a toggle option for the minimap, but they do go a long way in cultivating a strong sense of immersion while also saving the player's time. When it comes to what type of navigational UI a game should use, I find the compass to be far more preferable than the minimap. It often contains a lot of the same information, but is less distracting as it's usually centered and designed to not stand out so much. Also, while it shows the direction of a destination, it can't tell players the exact path they'll need to take, causing them to still have to figure out the best way to get where they're going. This allows for navigation to be a part of the gameplay while still giving players some guidance. For a while, I was a fan of when titles would have markers show up in the actual world that let players know where objectives are, but over the years I've stopped liking that as much. In my mind, it's still way better than a typical minimap, but they can lead to a lot of clutter, and also having a floating icon in front of you to mark a destination hurts how immersive a game can feel. For both compasses and minimaps, I'd love to see more titles experiment with how these pieces of UI are presented to the player. In a video I recently watched by Afterthoughts about the brilliance of Breath of the Wild stamina meter, in it she makes a point that the best UI operates under the principle out of mind, out of sight. The idea being that when the player doesn't need a piece of information, there is no reason to show it. This is easy to apply with certain pieces of UI, but when it comes to something like a minimap, it gets a bit more complicated, as there's not always a great way to tell whether or not the player is using it. So having it vanish periodically without any sort of player input could easily lead to frustration for people it disappears on when they're in the middle of checking it. There are instances in a lot of games though where it could work well. Like looking back at Elden Ring again, whenever the player is in a boss fight, the compass goes away, because their focus should be solely on the fight, so why have it there? This helps add to the epic feel of each battle, as they aren't bogged down by unnecessary UI. As most games have sections that have nothing to do with travel, they almost certainly could benefit from this approach. As far as what to do with the minimap while players are traversing the world, I think it'd be interesting if titles transitioned between different types of navigation systems for different actions. So like if the player is investigating a small area, the minimap could be on screen to assist with finding precise locations. But once they are clearly traveling to a destination navigation, presumably by getting on their horse or into a vehicle, it would shift to a compass, providing guidance without being in the way. This doesn't solve how to play without navigational UI, and obviously still has players relying on it heavily, but at the very least, a system like that would be providing information tailored to certain modes of play, cutting out the excess distractions. All in all, I don't think minimaps should cease to exist. Not every title wants navigation to be a core part of the gameplay. Also, as I said before, minimaps are enjoyed by a lot of folks and help make games more accessible. The main thing I want is for there to be more options surrounding them. In a perfect world, every game would allow players to quickly toggle them on and off, disable bits of information on them, and even choose what form of navigational UI they want to use. More options only serve to better personalize any game experience to the individual playing. With that said, I also would like to see more titles have the default setting be one that doesn't feature the navigational UI as heavily. I think a lot of people don't critically look at the ways in which they rely on minimaps and compasses when playing games. It has sort of just become the norm to use them, and they've grown comfortable in that. So why would they choose anything else? They've become complacent in a way and miss out on some of the depth that games could offer. In turn, I believe this causes some developers to think players will enjoy their games the most if minimaps are a prominent feature, which I don't think is actually the case. It's just that when given the choice between getting no help with navigation and too much of it, most people will choose the latter. By having the default state be one that aims to keep navigational UI out of mind as much as possible, it will challenge players to try something new and push developers to not use these tools as just a way to fill in the gaps. At the end of the day, what I want most is to be able to engage with gorgeous and expansive worlds without having to choose between either needing to constantly pause to get my bearings or feeling compelled to look at the corner of my screen every 5 seconds. I like when games let me feel smart, and at least with how things stand right now, minimaps get in the way of that. But I hope they won't forever. And speaking of wanting to feel smart, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is a problem-solving website that provides interactive courses made to teach you new ideas and hone your understanding of topics primarily relating to math and science. For those of you looking to learn something new or get a refresher on topics you've long since forgotten, Brilliant is an incredible way to do so. In my youth, there were a lot of things I never ended up learning as I didn't have the time to take classes in certain subjects. And now as an adult, I find it difficult to sit down and teach myself those sorts of things as I don't know where to begin. And that's why Brilliant is great, as it gives a frame to work within on your own time with courses that are actually fun to do, making it much easier to stick to. I recently have been taking a course on special relativity, and I learned that despite thinking I understood anything about space-time, I didn't. But now I do. Take that, Einstein. There are so many different topics to choose from, and they're really effective at teaching complicated concepts. So to get started, go to brilliant.org/Rasputin and sign up for free. The first 200 people that go to the link, which is also in the description, will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. It's a really great service that will teach you cool stuff, so check it out. Anyway, thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. For everyone still here, hey. Thank you so much to my patrons for making this channel possible, and a special shout out to William Glenn H for being an honorary bagbuten. That's all I got for this one. Have a great day and or night, and I'll see you in the next one.